Hi, I'm Lauren Loader, and this is my talk for OPUS 2020 for my senior show. Worship is defined by Merriam-Webster as to regard with great or extravagant respect, honor, or devotion. The idea of worship has intrigued me since I was young, because what we worship affects how we act. The choices we make define who we are. My parents, when they met in Alcoholics Anonymous, were defined as alcoholics. They chose to lean into Alcoholics Anonymous and learn more about God. After a few years of leaning into God and the program, my parents began to define themselves as recovering addicts. Now, my parents are almost never defined by their alcoholism because as they turn their worship and actions from dependence upon alcohol, they began to change. My work is a direct reflection of growing up, knowing about the changes that we make when we worship different things. Because their alcohol was behind them by the time I arrived, don't worry, I had a mostly stable and loving childhood. I can see alcoholism and the worship of those things differently than those who grew up with their parents not having this problem or not admitting that they had this problem. Sol LeWitt defined art this way. In conceptual art, the idea or concept is the most important aspect of the work. When an artist uses a conceptual form of art, it means that all of the planning and decisions were made beforehand, and the execution is a perfunctory affair. I focus mainly on the idea of my work before performing the act of creating it in the real world. My sculptures live in my head like caged animals until I've determined they should be released into the world. Once they are introduced into the world through a drawing, they demand which materials fit them best, because they have quite interesting personalities. Materials signify histories and cultural references. In my work knowledge, the sculpture consisting of hundreds of books, stacked like an Old Testament altar, topped with praying hands, it is about the fetishization of knowledge we have in this country. As a society, we place ever-growing pressure on people to go to college and get a college degree. We praise the knowledge seeker and admonish the people who don't subscribe to the notion that knowledge is above all else. On the other end of the spectrum is the glorification of ignorance. I believe James K.A. Smith said it best in his book, You Are What You Love, when he said, "To recognize the limits of knowledge is not to embrace ignorance." We don't need less than knowledge, we need more. My work is trying to live in the in-between. Neither side of this war is good, but in the in-between, we find a healthy balance. My work is about presenting these ideas so that maybe you connect with one of the ways of worship I am presenting, and it makes you think about how your choices are affected by worshiping this idea the way that you do. I make work about the American culture and things within it because that's what's interesting to me. I am able to think outside of this culture because I grew up both within and outside of America. Growing up in Germany for as long as I did gave me quite a different experience of culture than my friends. I grew up being too American to be German and too German to be American. And I was forever on the outside of these two cultures to which I belong. I became, for a long time, a third culture kid. A third culture kid is someone raised in a culture other than their parents or the culture of their country of nationality for a significant part of their early development years. And constantly, I began to feel like an outsider. I began to identify how what I experienced is so different from anything anyone else I know has experienced. In that outsideness, I found that I could critique a society in which many of my friends are bound. They never had to be thinking about wondering why Americans believe that we have the world's highest standard of living. To quote Margaret Bourke White's photograph from 1937 at the time of the Louisville flood. This picture to me signifies everything about American culture that I have been questioning my entire life. This photograph I remember seeing in my US history class in 10th grade, and ever since, I have found that this picture symbolically references everything that I question and know about American culture. We have this idea that there's no way like the American way, but then you see the people waiting in line to get bread and waiting in line for all of these things that they need. It signifies the Great Depression and also, for me, my questioning of American culture. But people who grew up in America never had to question the things that they grew up knowing. In the outsideness of being from two cultures, I found that I could critique a society in which many of my friends are bound. People in societies that don't grow up outside that society have problems seeing certain things in certain ways. Without question, Americans grow up and have certain things embodied in their souls. People in every culture across the world have different things emblazoned into them. English people, that tea is proper and there is a certain protocol for these things. Americans, that we all think that everyone knows about the Super Bowl and cares about American football when 90% of the population outside of America doesn't care. But anyway, this is important because I, an outsider of culture, was able to look at the world in a completely new and fascinating way to create art by. For Arthur Danto, art had to have aboutness and embodiment. It means to have a reason for being, that an art object may be made of commonplace objects, that has intentionality that sets it apart from the everyday. My art takes everyday objects and represents items of value and meaning within the American culture. My work centers around using everyday objects to represent objects Americans worship. In my sculpture, Religion, there is a gilded book hanging in the middle of pages falling from the book over a pair of praying hands. All the objects in this sculpture are everyday objects that are chosen to represent items with cultural significance. The way in which I choose items with cultural significance is inspired by a sculptor named Damien Ortega. His monumental scaled sculptures of objects hanging in space take over the viewer's sense of scale. His projects deconstruct and reassemble instruments of construction. The amalgam of saws or tortillas inspires me in my sculptures to think about everyday objects, as well as the imagery we associate with these things. In my own work, I utilize the imagery of the white picket fence to talk about the worship of the American dream, because the white picket fence has become so ingrained into the societal imagery that everyone understands a white picket fence is inherently about this topic. My work is about worship and about the different forms of worship. It is about how worship affects who we are. I hope that when you look at my work, you start to think about the things you worship and how that affects who you are. In the end, maybe it creates an idea in you that maybe what you're worshiping isn't what you think it is at all. Thank you.